G'day and welcome to another video by the Eccentric Electrician. Today I'll be talking about stubs, italics and cursive italics. I'm not a professional in this, but this is sort of what I picked up from purchasing from Nib Masters online, other videos and doing a bit of research myself. There doesn't seem to be a big culture where the difference between a stub italic and a cursive italic is really defined. Quite often cursive italics are referred to as italics, or stubs are referred to as cursive italics, or vice versa. The two biggest differences is between an actual stub and an italic itself. I'll get to that in a minute. The cursive italic tends to be somewhere in between the two, but can be used interchangeably. There's no dictated, this is how a cursive italic should look. It's just basically somewhere between a dead flat sharp italic and a rounded stub. Alright, so what is a stub, an italic or a cursive italic? In general, you're talking about a nib that is actually wide. A normal pen, I'll just grab one out. A normal pen, when you look at it, the nib is actually round on top. You can look at the end. You'll see that the actual tip is actually quite round. I'll try and zoom in on this using a loupe. There we go. So if you look at that, the tip's actually quite round. And if you look this way as well, this one's got a little bit of a stub quality to it. It's probably because it's a slightly thicker pen, but it's basically rounder. When you're talking about a stub, you're talking about something like this, where the end of the nib is actually basically more of a rectangular or an oval shape. I'll try and get up close on the end of that. As you can see there, that's the end of this tip. It's quite a bit different to the other one. This is a lot larger stub, so it's a lot more obvious. So you can see that there's a difference. Now, why would you want this? The big reason why people want these sorts of nibs are so it provides a natural line variation. Typically, line variation is only given by using a flex nib. And then by flexing, you get line variation in your writing. Using a stub nib, you get that just naturally without having to flex or know any sort of fancy calligraphy. You can just write normally, and it looks like you're almost doing some sort of calligraphy yourself. Alright, so this is a normal nib. I'll just give a bit of an example of what I mean. So the downstrokes and the cross strokes are the same. There's no real differentiating between the two. And when you write, it basically just gives you a straight line. Now, when you use an italic, cursive italic or a stub, you get this effect where the downstroke is generally a lot larger than the cross stroke. This provides you some line variation when writing. As you can see here, the cross stroke's a lot finer, the downstroke's a lot thicker. So this is purely just so when you write, you can have that line variation without having to try. There you go, so you get natural line variation. Alright, so there's different types of stubs italics and cursive italics. Some nibs will have tipping, some won't. The tipping, unless you're talking about a gold nib that doesn't have tipping, a steel nib, you know, it's not going to make a huge difference. Steel is quite hard wearing, like this one from Goulet pens. Quite hard wearing, and you're not really going to wear it out or cause any major issues. Whereas I've got a gold nib here. This is off a vintage pen. See if I can get it in focus. And you can see that on the end there, you've actually got iridium tipping, but this is on a 14 karat pen. Obviously, if you didn't have the tipping on a gold nib, you could have issues with it wearing through quite quickly. Alright, so this one here that I was using is probably one of the more common stub nibs that people would come across. It's the Goulet Pens Italic, Stub. I think this is the 1.5 millimeter stub. Now what 1.5 means is the actual thickness of the stub across. So this is 1.5 millimeters across and should create a 1.5 millimeter line on the page. I actually have this one in just a Noodler's Ahab, and it works quite well. Alright, so what's the difference between a stub and an italic? I'll start there because that's the easiest way to tell. This pen here is a stub. Now, what makes it a stub is if you see at the actual tip, the nib has rounded corners on the edges, and the same thing all the way around. It's so you can write like this, and actually drag the pen all the way down. You won't actually notice any sharp edges or any corners. Same as going sideways. The corners are all rounded off, so the nib looks more like this, with the edges here rounded off. This is to provide an easier writing when you're doing everyday writing. These are the sorts of stub nibs and setup that you want if you're going to use it day in, day out. Now, the difference between this and an italic, I'll just bring out this old Schaefer italic. So this is a Schaefer italic. When I can zoom in on it, there we go. You can actually see on this one, the end of the nib is actually dead straight. It also has sharp corners, which you could actually cut the page with. An italic is generally used when you want a perfectly straight line. It's used in more of your fancy calligraphies, and it's used just to provide a sharper line. The reason for that is the nib on this pen is shaped like that, so your corners aren't rounded off, and it's normally shaped to a perfect rectangular shape. It again provides the same line variation. But you can actually feel and hear the sharpness of the nib. If you're not careful with an italic, you can actually cut straight through your page, which obviously would be a bad thing because then you'd ruin 2 pages. I'll get in a close-up of this nib. There you go. So here you can see how sharp the edges are. See if I can get a close-up of the tip. And there you go as well. It's quite a sharp edge all around, and yeah, it's just purely for this line variation. Now the area where it makes a difference is mainly only on apart from writing day in, day out, it's to provide these sharp corners when you write. As you might be able to see here, this corner written by the Goulet Stub is a lot softer. It's quite almost a round corner, whereas the one done by the Schaefer italic is actually quite a sharp corner. Now that's really the only difference between the two when writing. Like in the looks of your writing, is that you get the sharp corners. Like I said, for everyday writing, you definitely want to consider your stub rather than your italic. Your italics are generally only used when people are doing their fancy calligraphy and fancy writings. I've got a few pens here, and I'll go through them shortly. The other type of nib is your Cursive Italic. Now I've got a few types of Cursive Italics here. I've got one, here it is. I have a Mike Muscleyama broad Cursive Italic. It'll come into focus. There we go. Now the difference between the Stub, Cursive Italic and Italic is that on the Cursive Italic, the corners aren't rounded as much. It's basically a cross between the Cursive Italic and, the Italic and the Stub. It gives you a slightly better writing experience while providing slightly sharper edges. Obviously, the other thing with stubs is, depending on how large they go, the line variation will differ. As this is actually a broad nib ground to a stub, your line variation isn't as much as it would be with, say, a properly made stub for the task, such as the Goulet or any of the other Franklin and Christoph music pens and such. It's hard to see. You only really notice the difference if you were to look closely at the writing. See if I can sort of bring that up. You can see that the corners are a lot sharper here than they are here, and it's basically not too much of a difference between the Stub and the Cursive Italic itself. It's just slightly sharper, but it all comes down to personal preference and what you actually prefer. So that was a broad stub. This one up here is a Goulet 1.5mm stub, and this purple one was the Schaefer Italic. I might have a few issues with this nib, but that's mainly because I only just serviced it, rescued it out of a rubbish bin. So, they're your main types of stub nibs. You've got your Stub, your Cursive Italic, and your Cursive Italic and your Italic. So, depending on what you want to do, you need to choose which type of stub nib which type of nib you want. I'll go through a couple of different brands. So you've already seen the Goulet Nib, which is a stub nib with rounded corners and quite a nice writing experience. Nice and smooth, good for everyday use. Again, like I said, depending on who you actually go to, the stubs will be ground differently as well. For example, this one by Mike Masuyama, I generally consider to be a bit sharper. It feels a bit sharper than, say, I've got a Parker 51 here by Greg Manuskin. Really nice writer. I'd consider this one to be a little bit more of a stub than a Cursive Italic, and the Mike Masuyama one's a Cursive Italic. Both of them, I believe, when they were ground, called them stubs. But there's a slight difference when you write with it. So if you don't like a stub from one person, you might like it from the next. So if you like the idea and like the writing, and maybe just specific things about that stub you don't like, you might want to speak to the Nibmeister, and they can either make it softer for everyday writing, or they can make it sharper for more defined lines. Some other common stubs, italics and stubs, is say this Lamy. When I can get in on it. There we go. So Lamy do a 1.5 and I believe a 1.1 stub. This is the 1.5. And again, this is a fairly rounded nib. This would be a pretty classic stub. Quite a nice nib to write with. Personally, I'm not a fan of the Safari, but I did buy a few extra nibs just to try out the stub nib for the first time. So these are another good alternative. Again, these aren't tipped, but you don't really need to tip them. They're a steel nib, so they'll last a while. And even if they didn't, the replacement nibs for these are fairly cheap. Another one is, this is another one. This is an actual stub grind from Mike Musuyama. Again, out of abroad. So it's got slightly rounded, more rounded corners than this red one had, which was a Cursive Italic. So this one writes a bit smoother again. Another vintage one. This is a Greg Manuskin stub as well, and it's writes fairly smooth. It's got slightly sharper corners when moving left to right. Up and down, it's a lot smoother. This one does have tipping, obviously, because it's a 14K nib, so you sort of need to have that. Another popular one is the Twisbys. This is the Twisby Mini with a 1.1mm stub, and again, these are actual stubs and not italics or cursive italics. And this is another one again. This is the Nemosini or Nemosine, however it's pronounced. Again, this is a real rounded stub I found with this one. This one's like almost like a really triple broad nib, but they call it their stub, and this is the 0.8mm stub. Quite a nice little setup on there. So stubs you get anywhere from about 0.5, I think, for a medium stub, right up to, you know, your Franklin Christoph, which is one of the largest stub nibs I know of. There you go. This is their music nib, so it's got three tines, 2 slits going up the middle there, 1.9mm stroke. So this is a very wide pen. This I wouldn't use for everyday use. It's more for calligraphy type work. It is a stub. It's got nice rounded corners, very smooth, nice to use. Now, there's many different types when you go into these, and another common type for calligraphy work is a pilot parallel. Now, this is the 6mm one, so I believe this is the largest one they do. I could be wrong there. So this actually has 2 plates that act as a nib and feed. Now, this does a very wide line, and this would actually be considered a italic, almost. Yeah. It's got very sharp edges, so if you wanted to, you can do a fine line, or you can just down or across. Now, the reason these are used, again, is this would not be usable for everyday writing. It's primarily for your calligraphy writing. Now, I'm no specialist in calligraphy writing, but let's have a little bit of a crack. So there you go. It's basically to provide a large amount of line variation. So there you go. Your choices are your cursive italic for everyday use, which provides a slightly sharper line. You've got your standard stub, which is an everyday use design. Then you've got your italic, which is primarily for your calligraphy with your sharp lines. And like I said, the standard italic would not be recommended for people just learning, especially if you're very new to fountain pens. If you press too hard, you can cut through your paper or tear the page. And then you've got your intermediates, which can be anywhere in between. So, like I said, there's a big choice in stub nibs and italics, and it all depends on what you really want. So it's always worth to give them a try. I quite like my stubs. I prefer the Mike Musuyama or Greg Manuskin stubs, but any of these cheaper ones are just as good. Alright, thanks for watching. I hope this has helped, and goodbye.